Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the book of Judges, introducing this book. Judges spans the gap we have in our Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. We call those the books of Moses, and then of course Joshua comes after that. But Judges spans the gap from Joshua to the time we begin reading about the kings of Israel, like in 1st and 2nd Samuel. 1 Samuel is the story of Saul, King Saul, and the 2nd Samuel is the story of King David, and after that we have Solomon and following. In the book of Joshua, it's mostly a story of victory, but Judges is mostly stories of defeat. Yes, there's an occasional victory here and there, but all too often it's a sad story. In the book of Joshua, one man is prominent, the man Joshua. In Judges, we have a number of judges, both men and women, who will be seen in this book. In Joshua, it's all about Israel's faith. In Judges, it's all about Israel's apostasy, where the Israelites continue again and again and again to turn away from God and suffer the results of that. In the book of Joshua, they're taking a stand for God. Joshua is leading the nation there. In the book of Judges, they are turning away from God. In the book of Joshua, we see the sins of the Canaanites that are being judged. In Judges, it's the sin of the Israelites that are being judged. Now, there are a number of things in this book that indicate an early composition, an early writing, at least for certain portions of the book. For example, the Jebusites are said to live in Jerusalem. And Judges chapter 1, verse 21 says, to this day. Well, that wouldn't be the case once we get to 2 Samuel chapter 5, verse 7, when Jerusalem is captured by the Israelites and becomes an Israelite city. So this portion of the book, at least, sounds like it's being written back in the days before that had taken place. Likewise, we read of Sidon, the Phoenician city up the coast, being described as the chief city of the Phoenicians. And that wouldn't be the case. It would be overshadowed at a later date. So again, these things posit a early composition. And yet, for example, we read, in those days Israel had no king. That's going to be the refrain in Judges chapter 17, and again in 18, and twice at least, once in chapter 19 and once again in chapter 21. And by saying that, there's a hint there. If I say, back in those days we didn't have automobiles, when I say that, I'm assuming that now we do have automobiles. Likewise, when it says in those days Israel had no king, that sounds like the writer is saying, but now we do, but back then we didn't. And so, yes, an early date, but not that early. Another example is Judges chapter 18, verse 30, where we read about the sons of Dan, how they set up for themselves graven images, and Jonathan, the son of Gershom, the son of Manasseh, he and his sons were priests to the tribe of Danites, and we'll see that when we get to that chapter. But notice, until the day of the captivity of the land. Now that sounds like, it might not be, but it sounds like it's talking about the captivity, in other words, the captivity of either the Israelites being taken away into captivity at the hands of the Assyrians, 721 BC, or maybe even the Babylonian captivity, 586 BC. And if that's true, then that's saying at least this section of the book is written much later. Now, the book itself can be outlined. It's not going to be an easy outline. Actually, it's going to be sort of extensive. We begin in the first two chapters with a two-part prologue that sort of sets the stage for what is to come. And then there's a real brief narrative. A judge by the name of Othniel is mentioned, only a few verses. And then we have Ehud, the story of the left-handed man, the man who'd been bound in his right hand. And as we're going to see, that makes him a bit of a social outcast. And so you have the Ehud narrative. The judge is a social outcast, and he's dealing with oppressors from the east side of the Jordan, specifically from Moab. And then we have the Deborah story, or we call it the Deborah Barak, because Barak is the military leader of the Israelites. And a woman, and it won't be Deborah, it'll be someone else, slays the enemy with a blow to the head. That's chapters 4 and 5. And then we come to the story of Gideon. So notice a number of these judges: Othniel, Ehud, Deborah, and Gideon. And Gideon's going to will occupy the central stage in the story of the book of Judges, 3 chapters dealing with Gideon, 6, 7, and 8. And then we have the Abimelech narrative, the Gideon's son, Abimelech, but he's not a good guy. And again, we see a woman slaying the enemy with a blow to the head. A little bit of a parallel there. And then we had Ehud. Now we have the Jephthah narrative. Again, the judge is a social outcast. Again, they are dealing with oppressors from east of the Jordan. This time it's the Ammonites, not the Moabites. Now we have the Samson narrative. Actually, it's quite a long story, chapters 13 through 16. But in both cases, the Philistines are seen as the bad guys. And finally, we have an epilogue in 2 parts. And in the epilogue, we're going to have to actually spend quite a bit of time because that will make understandable the rest of the Old Testament, especially when we get to 1st and 2nd Samuel, that are almost incomprehensible. So we're going to miss some big things if we don't read and get to know that epilogue. Now we come to the purpose of the book. The purpose of the book of Judges. First of all, to demonstrate the disastrous effects of compromise. The Israelites are going to be seen compromising on the law. They will start worshiping other gods, and that won't be a good story. To give an apologetic also for Israel's monarchy. It's going to show how Israel needs a king, and when we look at those last 2 stories, in the epilogue, it's going to be talking about the need for that king. In fact, the refrain will be that in those days there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And that wasn't a good thing. It was not a good thing. And so they need a king, but we're going to notice the geographical pointers where they need the king from Bethlehem. And in that, there's going to be a noted anti-Benjamin slant at the end of the book. And that's significant because you remember who the first king of Israel is. It's not going to be King David from Bethlehem. It will be King Saul. And even though King Saul becomes king, that story won't end well. And instead, the point's going to be made that they really need the king from Bethlehem. And of course, the king that comes from Bethlehem is David. But really, the greater king that comes from Bethlehem is David's descendant, and that is Jesus. And so this book is going to point us in the direction of the Hebrew Messiah. It will ultimately point us to Jesus.